Greetings, you're listening to the Cold Call Lawcast, the Minnesota Law School podcast featuring students from the University of Minnesota Law School, the University of St. Thomas School of Law, and the Mitchell-Hamline School of Law. Welcome everyone to the Cold Call Lawcast. I'm Mitch, a first-year law student at the University of St. Thomas School of Law, and with me are my co-hosts.
Hi, I'm Abby. I'm from the University of Minnesota Law School. I'm a 1L.
Hello, I'm Anthony. I'm a 2L at the Mitchell-Hamline School of Law.
Welcome everybody. With us today is a special guest, Helene Haapala. Helene is an attorney and co-coordinator of the Legal Observer Program at the National Lawyers Guild, the Minnesota chapter. She's also involved in the Women's March Minnesota as co-chair of the Rapid Response, and she led marshaling efforts for the 2018 Women's March Minnesota. She's also involved in a variety of other advocacy groups. So thank you, Helene, for joining us.
Glad to be here.
And I'm glad you're also able to come out with the storm and everything going on here. For those listening, we're recording on Wednesday, February 20th. I think we got like 72 feet of snow or something like that today.
Roughly. So I think the city's acting like they did.
Well, I know that we broke the February record for Minnesota today.
So already.
It's the snowiest February ever since they've been keeping track.
Wow.
I did not know that.
Living up to our name.
Feet. We got 89 feet. I heard that.
Yeah, that sounds about right. 89 feet.
So could you give us a little bit of your background?
Well, I originally moved to Minnesota to go to grad school in immigration history, and back in the late 70s, and sort of ran out of money and interest after a year, and had an advisor that was not too available to his students, let's say.
Oh no.
So then I kind of bounced around for a couple of years, and I had the idea in my head since I was a kid to go to law school. So a friend who was in law school at the time kind of encouraged me and said, well, why don't you just take the LSAT and see what happens? And why don't you apply and see what happens? And eventually I ended up going to William Mitchell and graduating from there in 1986.
Okay. Excellent. Anthony is from what is now the
Mitchell-Hamline.
Hamline, Mitchell, or whatever it is.
You said you jumped around a little bit before you entered law school. Do you remember any of those jobs, after undergrad, but before going to law school?
Yeah, actually, I drove a city bus for a couple of years, which was an interesting experience in lots of ways. I think, and I mean that positively. I mean, I still, that was years ago, but I still tend to know where all the bus routes are in Minneapolis and how to get to places based on what bus route gets you there, even if I'm not taking the bus. And so that's what I did for most of that time. I worked for a little bit of time for a housing nonprofit. But I was at the MTC for I think close to 3 years.
Wow!
And where did you do your undergraduate in, and what degree did you get?
I have a bachelor's in history, and it's from Carthage College in Kenosha, Wisconsin. It's sort of the Augsburg of Wisconsin.
Yeah. Hey.
And so, what were some of your best and worst parts about your experience being in law school?
I found it to be really different than the year that I had spent in grad school, partly because I don't know if it's different now, but there was so much posturing that went on in law school. Everybody had to act like they were okay all the time, even if they looked like they were going to, puke in the next 2 minutes walking into a final. And you'd say, like, how are you? And they'd be like, fine, I got this, And so, and the way that in both undergrad and in my grad school experience, people were not as secretive about grades. I mean, it was just kind of a more open kind of atmosphere in law school. There just was a lot of posturing which I found sort of difficult or weird, I guess. At that time, and still, what was really cool about Mitchell was, or Helen Mitchell as it is now, was for those of us that were having, that were working pretty much full time, putting ourselves through school. They had the afternoon program, and there were ways that you could go to school and still, have a job and earn money to eat, and stuff like that. And also one of the really neat things about Mitchell was that because it was a number of people like myself that had a little break in between undergrad and now, sometimes a longer break, sometimes a shorter break, but there was so much diversity in terms of the students in my cohort, in my class, because people had all kinds of experiences. The guy that sat next to me all of first year had been a pharmacist for like 10 years.
Oh, wow.
There were people that were nurses. There were people that had been in various kinds of business. There were, there was just a lot of sort of life experience. And it wasn't just all kind of people that had just graduated from undergrad and now were going on to law school. And I thought that was a wonderful addition.
And what did you do after you graduated from law school?
I did kind of did a number of things. I worked for a couple of years for what was kind of a quasi legal services office, even though it technically wasn't, but it was run like one. We did Medicare appeals for people that were in nursing homes that were eligible for both Medicare and medical assistance. I worked for a while in a small law practice doing a lot of driving violation kind of stuff, including DUIs. And then for like the last close to 20 years until last fall, I worked at Thomson Reuters at Westlaw, updating legal content. I updated state court rules for 13 states, not Minnesota, but or Wisconsin, but a bunch of other states.
So how long did you say you were at Thomson Reuters for?
I was there like 18 years, and then I had always been involved in a lot of volunteer stuff, a lot of advocacy stuff on the side. So I did what some people would call retiring, but I call realigning, and left there last fall, and am actually in a master's program at Metro State in advocacy and political leadership, and then have really kind of ramped up my involvement with things like the Lawyers Guild and with the Women's March and with some other groups and political entities.
And so you mentioned the National Lawyers Guild, and of course you coordinate the Legal Observers program. So what is the National Lawyers Guild, and kind of how is it different than the ABA or ACLU or other legal programs?
It was actually founded in the 1930s as kind of a progressive alternative to the ABA, which was seen as being pretty conservative and pretty traditional at the time. So I think it was in 1937 that the National Lawyers Guild was founded. It was from the beginning very involved with a lot of labor groups. It was the first integrated association of attorneys, and I think was that for a long time. That the ABA was, some people would say it's still pretty conservative, but it was a lot more conservative back then. The Lawyers Guild was just kind of, I guess I would, now, in 2019, it would still be kind of the progressive, legal group, like kind of the opposite of the Federalist Society or the, and now, of course, there's a lot of affinity bars and various other bar organizations. But I think back then there weren't as many. So, it was an option for people that were into a little more progressive stuff.
Okay.
And there's still, and it operates, in the U.S. I think until like Not sure exactly when, but the membership used to just be open to attorneys, but now it's been opened up for several decades to paralegals and, other legal workers of various sorts who are involved in legal work and, see it from more of a progressive bent.
Mm-hmm.
And so what specifically is the Legal Observers program within the National Lawyers Guild?
What the Legal Observers program is, it's really just kind of another set of eyes. In many ways, impartial, but clearly kind of looking at what is happening with people in power, meaning the people wearing uniforms at protests or events or other type activities where there may be confrontations between activists and law enforcement.
Oh, I was just going to say, is this mostly at protests?
Yeah, so it's mostly at protests. I mean, in the time that I've been involved here, and so a lot of that happens more in the summer. People just tend to have protests more in the summer.
They don't want to protest in this weather? What?
Well, actually, there were some events around the Super Bowl when the Super Bowl was here last year, and we had legal observers there because there was certainly a heavy police presence there. And what legal observers do is that they're just kind of there. They don't participate on either side, but they're there to take notes and to kind of document what goes on, so that if there are arrests or if there is some kind of action afterwards, there is somebody there that can have some documentation, have some, written stuff about what they observed happening. Sometimes just having observers there diffuses things, because if folks know they're being watched, they're less likely to act inappropriately. When the Philando Castile verdict came down, there was a big event, a big action in St. Paul. There were a lot of observers there. Observers usually don't get arrested. They don't, as far as I know. Like at that event, there were no observers that went on the freeway. We were just there to kind of watch what went on. And that was an event where there was some of the protesters were arrested.
Yeah.
So how does someone become a legal observer? And is it only for lawyers, or can other people become involved as well?
You don't have to be a lawyer. You don't even have to be a legal worker. I mean, there are actually Jill Jacobson, the other coordinator for the observers in the Twin Cities here, is a teacher, public school teacher. It helps, I think, because I think it helps to have. Number one, there's trainings that people go through, and it's not an extensive training. I mean, we did one at St. Thomas this fall. We did one at the U Law School this fall. We're looking at doing one at Hamlin Mitchell sometime this spring. But because there's just some kind of key things that you need to be aware of. But I think it helps if you have some kind of basic understanding of either from having been an activist, kind of on the other side, of how these things work and what usually happens at events and how to, what to be on the lookout for and that kind of stuff.
Mm-hmm.
And there's going to be another one at St. Thomas, I think next week sometime. I'm not doing it. Somebody else is doing it, or like it's like the first week in March, there's some kind of action week or involvement week or activity week or something like that. Amanda, who I think is a 1L at St. Thomas, she's the one that coordinated the last one, and she's the one that's been setting up the one for March.
Oh, that's awesome. So she's a 1L.
Yeah, she's a 1L, and she just kind of, I think part of the reason that law students get involved with being observers a lot is because a lot of people come to law school with a lot of idealism, and everybody wants to be a public interest lawyer, and everybody wants to save the world, and so a lot of people are more inclined to for that kind of involvement.